These papers found among the effects of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston, and I read from them to you tonight precisely as they came to me. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open such terrifying vistas that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Now, theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle and have hinted at strange survivals, but it is not from them that I caught that glimpse of forbidden eons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. And I dream of it often. The glimpse flashed out instead from an accidental piecing together of two separate things: an old newspaper article and the notes of a dead professor. Now, I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing together. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply any link in so hideous a chain. And I'm sure that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding what he knew, and he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death intervened. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 with the death of my great uncle, George Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages at Brown University. Now, the professor was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, so his passing at the age of 92 naturally drew widespread attention. Interest was intensified, however, by the cause of his death. He had been stricken while returning home from the Newport boat terminal. He'd fallen suddenly after having been jostled by what one witness described as, and I quote, a nautical-looking Negro who'd come from one of the dark corners on the hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the professor's home on William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder and concluded that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for his death. At the time, I saw no reason to doubt this, but now I am inclined to wonder. Now, as my great-uncle's heir and executor, I was required to go over his papers, and for that purpose, I moved his files and boxes to my home in Boston. Now, much of this material will, I'm sure, one day be published in academic journals. But there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling and which I felt reluctant to show to other eyes. It had been locked, and I didn't find the key until it occurred to me to examine the personal key ring which the professor always carried in his pocket. And then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but having done so, seemed only to be confronted by a more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed writings that I found? The relief was a rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 inches by 6 inches in area. It was obviously of modern origin, although its designs were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, because although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing, and writing of some kind the bulk of these designs clearly seem to be. Above these hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, although its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a monster, or a symbol representing a monster, a pulpy tentacled head surmounted a scaly body with rudimentary wings. It was altogether quite grotesque, and if I say that my imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a malformed human being, then I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. The notes that accompanied this oddity were written in the professor's hand, and what seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult. Cthulhu Cult. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925 Dream and Dreamwork of H.A. Wilcox, and the second Narrative of Inspector John R. LeGrasse of New Orleans. And the first half of this document told a very peculiar story indeed. It appears that on March the 1st, 1925, a young man had called upon Professor Angel in a state of high excitement, bearing the clay bas-relief, which was then damp and clearly freshly made. His card bore the name Henry Wilcox, and my uncle at once recognized him as the youngest son of a local family who was studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design. Now, Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and he had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams that he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive. The staid folk of Providence preferred the term queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. On the occasion of his visit to the professor, he'd asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. And my uncle had replied with some sharpness, because the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. But young Wilcox's reply was striking. "It is new indeed, Professor," he said. "For I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." And he began a rambling tale which nevertheless awoke a memory in the professor and won his fevered interest. There had been an earth tremor the night before, the most considerable, in fact, felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected by this. Upon retiring to bed, he said, he'd had a vivid dream of what he called great cyclopean cities, of vast blocks of stone and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent terror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars of this city, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which Wilcox attempted to render by an almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Photogn. Now, it was, in fact, this verbal jumble that stirred Professor Angel's recollection, and he proceeded to question his visitor intently. Now, many of his questions seemed odd to Wilcox, especially those which tried to connect him with certain strange cults. And he could not understand the repeated promises of silence which were offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some mystical or pagan society. When finally the professor did accept that Wilcox was indeed ignorant of such a cult, he besieged him with demands for future reports of dreams, and indeed this bore fruit, because after the initial interview, the manuscript records daily visits during which the young man related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery, whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone with a subterrene voice shouting apparent gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated, however, are rendered Cthulhu and Rylye. That's R''Lyeh. On March the 23rd, Wilcox failed to appear. He had been stricken with a fever and taken to his family home in Waterman Street. His febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on the strangest things, and he spoke wildly of a gigantic thing, miles high, which walked or lumbered about. Now, he never fully described this object, but occasional frantic words convinced the professor that it must be identical with the monstrosity that he had sought to depict in his sculpture. And then, on April the 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of the malady abruptly ceased. Wilcox sat up in the bed, upright, completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March the 22nd, and thenceforth, to Professor Angel, he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming vanished. Now, here the first part of the manuscript ended, but there were briefer notes appended to it which described the dreams of various other people and cover the same period. My uncle, it seems, had issued a far-flung request among his friends for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any visions of notes, and the response was varied. Average people in society and people in business, New England's salt of the earth, if you like, gave an absolutely, well, almost completely negative result, although scattered cases of uneasy nocturnal impressions do appear here and there between March the 23rd and April the 2nd. Scientific men were not much more affected, although 4 cases suggested fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one there's a mention of something alive and almost inconceivably large. It was from the artists and the poets, rather, that the most pertinent answers came, because between February the 28th and April the 2nd, a large proportion of these men experienced very bizarre dreams indeed. Now, over a quarter reported scenes and signs very like that which Wilcox himself had described. And some of the dreamers confessed an acute fear of a gigantic lumbering thing. One case was particularly sad. A well-known architect with known leanings towards theosophy went violently insane on the date of Wilcox's seizure and died several months later after screamed pleas to be saved from that intolerable denizen of hell. Now, I can't help thinking that something like panic would have broken loose had these people been able to compare notes. And then there was the second part of the professor's manuscript. Once before it emerged, he had seen the outlines of Wilcox's sculpted monster and had heard the ominous syllables Cthulhu. And in circumstances so strange that it is small wonder that he questioned the young sculptor so avidly. This earlier experience had come some 17 years before, in 1908, when the American Archaeological Society had held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angel had played a prominent part in the proceedings and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to bring problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking fellow who had travelled from New Orleans. His name was John Raymond Legrasse. By profession, he was an inspector of police. And with him he bore a grotesque and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. Now, it's not to be supposed that Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology himself. His wish for enlightenment was prompted purely by professional considerations, because this statuette, or this idol, or this fetish, whatever it was, had been captured several months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a cult which was heretofore entirely unknown to them and was one infinitely more diabolic than the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Now, of the cult's origin, nothing had been discovered apart from confused and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them identify the symbol and track down the cult to its fountainhead. Well, Inspector Legrasse was unprepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of this sculpture had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into the highest state of excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around to gaze at the diminutive figure whose strangeness and air of antiquity hinted at unopened vistas of research. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries, millennia perhaps, seemed to be recorded in its dim and greenish surface. The figure squatted evilly on a rectangular pedestal which was covered with undecipherable characters. It was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisite workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers. It had a scaly, bloated, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on the hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its material was also a mystery, because the soapy greenish-black stone with its iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing known to geology or mineralogy at the time, and the characters along the base were equally baffling. No member present, despite a representation of half the world's experts in the field, could form the least notion of their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and the material, belong to some remote and distant time from mankind, something suggestive of unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. And yet, as the scholars shook their heads and furrowed their brows, there was one present who detected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and in the writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle that he knew. This was the late William Channing Webb, the professor of anthropology at the time at Princeton University. Now, Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland. And high up on the West Greenland coast, he had encountered a singular tribe of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, which was a curious form of devil worship, had chilled him with its bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which the other Eskimos knew little and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from eons before the world was ever made. Now, besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain ancient invocations addressed to a supreme elder devil, or Tornasuk, as they named it. And of these, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged cult priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he could. But of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing, and as far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all the essential features of the thing now lying before the meeting. Now, these remarks, received with astonishment by the assembled members, proved to be doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse. Having himself noted and copied an oral ritual among the cultists he'd arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down among the Diabolist Eskimos. There then followed a comparison of details and a moment of awed silence, when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of a phrase common to the two hellish rituals, so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something like this. Fund Louis Maglunafa, Cthulhu Rilye, Uganagal Fatagun. Now, Legrasse had one advantage over Professor Webb, because several among his prisoners had translated the words for him, and he was confident that it meant, in his house at Rilye, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to a general demand from the assembled company, Legrasse related his own experiences with the swamp worshippers. On November the 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp country to the south of the city. The squatters there, who were mostly descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. Now, it was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than any of them had ever known before. Some of their women and children had disappeared since a malevolent tom-tom had begun beating far within haunted woods where no dweller dared venture. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, they said, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the people could stand it no more. And so, one afternoon, 20 New Orleans policemen had set out with a shivering squatter as a guide, and at the end of the passable road, they alighted and for miles splashed on through the terrible cypress woods where day never came, till at length a miserable huddle of huts hove in sight, and their inhabitants ran out to cluster around the bobbing lanterns. The beat of tom-toms was clearly audible far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth. Every one of the historical squatters refused point blank to advance another inch towards the scene. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region that they now entered was certainly of evil repute. There were legends there of a hidden lake in which dwelt a huge white polypus thing with luminous eyes. Squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns to worship it at midnight. To see it was to die, they said, but it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that was bad enough, and it seems likely that the very sight of the worship had terrified the squatters as much as the sounds themselves, and they were shocking sounds, said Legrasse. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whip themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawks that tore through those woods like storms from the gulfs of hell. And now and then the ululations would cease, and a chorus of voices would rise in chant, Fundlui maglunafa Cthulhu rilye oganagal fatagon, Fundlui maglunafa Cthulhu rilye oganagal fatagon. And then the police came within sight of the ritual. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a screaming which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. The rest simply stood trembling, nearly hypnotized with terror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island, perhaps an acre in extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry, and on this there leaped and twisted an indescribable horde of human abnormality. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the centre of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, and in top of this, incongruous in its diminutiveness, rested that vile statuette. From a wide circle of scaffolds, set at regular intervals around the fire, hung the mutilated bodies of women, children, and animals. And inside this circle, the worshippers jumped and roared in endless bacchanals. Now, it might have been imagination, it might have only been echoes, but one of Legrasse's men afterwards swore that he could hear antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far unlit spot deeper within the wood. Well, the horrified pause of the policeman was of comparatively brief duration. Although there must have been nearly 100 celebrants in the unholy throng, the police trusted in their firearms and plunged into them. For 5 minutes, the din and the chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 47 prisoners whom he forced into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded were carried away on stretchers. The image on the monolith was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse himself. Now, examined back at headquarters, the prisoners all proved to be men of a low and mentally aberrant type. They were mainly seamen, West Indians or Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. But it soon became clear that something deeper and older than fetishism was involved here. Because degraded and ignorant as they were, the worshippers held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their faith. They worshipped, as Legrasse had gathered it, what they called the Great Old Ones, entities who had lived ages before man and had come out of the sky. Now, these old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first man, who had formed a cult which had never died. Theirs was that cult. Now, the great ones, the great old ones, were not composed of flesh and blood, said the worshippers. They had shape, but that shape was not made of matter. And although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They lay in stone houses in the great city of Rilye, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. Their cult would always exist, the prisoners insisted, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu from his dark house in Rilye under the waters should rise and bring the earth once more beneath his sway. The carven idol represented this Cthulhu, and someday when the stars were ready, he would call and his worshippers would be waiting to answer him. Now, to a man, the prisoners denied any part in the ritual murders, and they averred that the killing had been done by black winged ones which had come to them from the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions. Now, Legrasse had done what he could to further research the historic affiliations of the cult, but the authorities at Tulane University had nothing to say about either cult or image, and his presence at the archaeological conference was a last attempt to shed some light upon the ghastly mystery. He lent the image to Professor Webb for some time, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and it remains still in his possession. He showed it to me himself not very long ago. It is a horrible, terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. Now, back then, I still privately suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult and the image in some direct way, and of having invented a series of dreams to continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. And so I made a trip to Providence to see him, and if need be, to rebuke him for imposing upon a learned and aged man. He lived then, Wilcox, in the Fleur de Lis building in Thomas Street. It's a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture. I found him in his rooms at work, and I at once conceded that his artistic genius is indeed profound and authentic. Now, he has somehow crystallized in clay and will, I trust, one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose, or Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Now, he asked me my business with little enthusiasm, but when I told him who I was, he showed more interest, because my uncle's probing of his dreams had excited his curiosity, and in a short time I became convinced of his sincerity, because he spoke of these dreams in a manner that one simply could not mistake. They and their subconscious residuum, he said, had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a statuette whose contours made me wince with the potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall ever having seen the original of this thing except in his dream, but the outlines, he said, had formed themselves insensibly under his hands, and it was, clearly to me, the monstrous shape of his delirium. You know, he described his dreams in a strangely poetic and vivid fashion. I could easily picture what he called the Cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry was all wrong, he said. You know, I could almost hear the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground, Cthulhu Fatagan, Cthulhu Fatagan. I mean, that he knew nothing of the cult, save from what my uncle had let fall, was absolutely clear. I took leave of him amicably, more puzzled than ever as to how he could have possibly received those weird, vivid dream impressions. Now, the manner of this cult had begun to fascinate me, and at times, I admit, I did have visions of winning some personal fame from researches into its origin and its connections. I visited New Orleans. I talked with Legras and others of the raging party. I even questioned one or two of the surviving prisoners. And what I now heard so graphically at first hand, although it was really no more than confirmation of what my uncle had written, it excited me afresh. You know, I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were. But one thing that I did begin to suspect was that my uncle's death was far from natural. He had, as I said, fallen on a narrow hill leading up from the old waterfront after a careless push from a dark-skinned sailor. And I could not forget the appearance of those cult members in Louisiana. It would, I thought, be no surprise to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as ancient as their rites and beliefs were. Legras and his men, it is true, had been let alone so far, but in Norway, a certain sailor who saw things is now as dead as my uncle. Both men had learnt too much, you see. Perhaps I shall go as they did, because I, too, have learned much. Now, if heaven ever does wish to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of paper in Paterson, New Jersey. I mean, it was nothing on which I would have naturally stumbled in the course of my daily round, because it was an old number of an Australian journal, Sydney Bulletin, for April the 18th, 1925. Now, I had by this point largely given up my inquiries into the Cthulhu cult, and I was visiting a friend in Paterson. He's the curator of the local museum, a mineralogist. And one afternoon, I was casually examining the storage shelves of his museum when my eye was caught by a picture in one of the old newspapers that had been spread beneath the stones on the shelves. Now, it was, as I've said, the Sydney Bulletin, and the picture was of a hideous stone image, almost identical with that which Legras had found in the swamp. Clearing the sheet with great excitement and no small amount of nerves, I scanned this item in detail. I mean, it was a brief article, but what it suggested was of portentous importance to my search. This is what it said. Mystery derelict found at sea was the heading. The freighter Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning in Darling Harbour, having in tow the disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, with one living and one dead man aboard. The living man was clutching a stone idol of unknown origin, regarding whose nature authorities at Sydney University profess complete bafflement, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht in a small carved shrine. This man, after recovering his senses, told a strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustav Johansen, a Norwegian, and had been second mate of the schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao on February the 20th with a complement of 11 men. The Emma, says Johansen, was thrown widely off course by the great storm of March the 1st, and on March the 2nd it encountered the Alert, manned by a crew of Kanakas and half-castes. Being ordered to turn back, the Emma's captain refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire upon the schooner. The Emma's men showed fight, and though their vessel began to sink, they managed to heave alongside the enemy boat and board her. They grappled with the crew and were forced to kill them all because of their abhorrent and desperate mode of fighting. 3 of the Emma's men, including the captain and first mate, were also killed. The remaining 8 proceeded to navigate the captured yacht and continued in their original direction. The next day, they landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore. Johansen is reticent about this and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Later, he and one companion reboarded the Alert and were beaten about by the storm of April the 2nd. From that time till his rescue on the 12th, he remembers little, and he does not recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no obvious cause and was probably due to exposure. Cable advices from Dunedin report that the Alert was well known as an island trader and bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. The frequent night trips of its crew to the woods attracted no little curiosity. It had set sail in great haste just after the storm of March the 1st. Our Auckland correspondent gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johansen is described as a sober and worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry at which every effort will be made to get to the root of this curious matter. Now, that was all that the Sydney publication had to say, together with the picture of the hellish image. But here, it struck me, were treasures of new data on the Cthulhu cult. I mean, the question that exercised me most of all was, other than the dates, what connected these events to those that have been so carefully noted by my uncle? I mean, certainly the coincidence of the dates was remarkable. And on March the 1st, February the 28th, according to the international date line, an earthquake and a storm had occurred. From Dunedin in New Zealand, the Alert and her crew had darted forth as if summoned, while on the other side of the earth, poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank cyclopean city, and a young sculptor had moulded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. On March the 23rd, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 dead. And on that same date, the dreams of sensitive men in New England assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a great monster, while an architect went mad and a sculptor lapsed into a delirium. And what of the storm of April the 2nd, when all dreams of the dank city ceased and Wilcox emerged unharmed from his strange fever? A cavalcade of questions thundered through my mind that evening. And after a day of hurried arrangements, I took a train for San Francisco. In less than a month, I was in Dunedin, where I found that little was known of the cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns, although there was vague talk about an inland trip that these strangers had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted on the distant hills. In Auckland, I learned that the surviving sailor, Gustav Johansen, had returned with yellow hair turned white, and after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney, he had sold his cottage and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his experiences, he would only tell his friends, well, no more than he told the Admiralty officials, and all that they could do was give me his Oslo address. Now, after that, I went to Sydney and I talked profitlessly with seamen and members of the Vice Admiralty Court. I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use, but I gained nothing from that. The crouching image with its cuttlefish head, scaly wings, and hieroglyphed pedestal was preserved in the museum there, and I studied it for a long time. It is a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same air of mystery, antiquity, and unearthly strangeness of material, which I noticed in Legras's rather smaller specimen. I mean, geologists in particular, the curator told me, were quite baffled by it, because they vowed that the earth held no rock like it. Well, I now resolved that I must visit Johansen in Oslo. And one autumn day, I landed at the trim wharves of that city. Now, Johansen's address lay in the old town, so I made the brief trip by taxicab, and I knocked at the door of a neat ancient building with a plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johansen was dead. He had not long survived his return, said his wife, because the doings at sea in 1925 had left him quite broken. He told her no more of them than he had told the public, but he had left a long manuscript of technical matters, as he said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual perusal. Well, how had he died, I asked, and she explained that during a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. 2 Lascar sailors had helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was gone. Physicians blamed his death on heart trouble and a weakened constitution. I felt sick. And I wish now that I had simply offered the good lady my condolences and caught the next boat out. But instead, persuading her that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript, I bore the document away and I began to read it on the long voyage home. I mean, it was in itself an artless, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at a post facto diary, and it strove to recall that last awful voyage day by day. I shan't give it to you in all its cloudiness and redundance. I'll give its gist, enough to show why the sound of water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johansen, a lucky fellow, didn't quite know everything, although he saw the city and he saw the thing. But you see, I might never sleep again calmly when I think of the horrors that lurk behind life in time and in space. So Johansen's diary began in just the way that he described it to the Vice Admiralty. The Emma in ballast had cleared Auckland on February the 20th and had felt the full force of the earthquake-born tempest. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when it encountered the Alert on March the 22nd. And I could feel in the writing Johansen's regret as he described her sinking. Now, of the crew of the Alert, he speaks with significant horror that there was some peculiarly abominable quality about them, he said, which made their destruction almost a duty. And then, driven by curiosity in their captured yacht, the men sighted a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea and came upon a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy Cyclopean masonry. Now, well, it can have been nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Rillier, built measureless eons ago by loathsome shapes that seeped down from dark stars. Here lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, sending out thoughts that infected men's dreams and called the faithful on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. Now, Johansen, of course, he could know nothing of that, but God knows, he soon saw enough. I suppose, really, that only a single mountaintop, the hideous monolith-crowned citadel wherein great Cthulhu is buried, actually emerged from the waters. And when I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, well, it makes death seem like a very welcome thing. Johansen and his men were awed from the very first by the cosmic majesty of the place. They must have guessed that this was not of this or any sane planet. Right? Awe at the unbelievable size of these greenish stone blocks, the height of the great carven monolith, the colossal statues. It is legible in every line of the sailor's frightened description. And without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen, in fact, achieved something very close to it when he spoke of this city, because instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on the broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces too great, he says, to belong to anything of this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. Now, I mention this talk about angles because it suggests something that Wilcox had told me of his dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place was abnormal somehow, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now, here I found an unlettered seaman saying the same thing, and he had gazed upon the terrible reality. Now, Johansen and his men landed at a sloping mud bank and clambered up over oozing blocks. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted through the miasma that welled out of this sea-soaked perversion. Twisted menace and suspense lurked in those crazy angles of carven rock, where a second glass showed concavity after the first had shown convexity. Now, something like very fright had come over the explorers before anything more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen, and each would have fled long before had he not feared the scorn of the others. And then one of the crew, Rodriguez, a Portuguese, climbed up the foot of the monolith, and he let out a cry. The rest ran up after him and beheld an immense carved door decorated with the now familiar squid dragon bas-relief. It was, Johansen said, like a great barn door. They all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel and jambs, although they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was wrong. Well, one could not be sure that the sea and ground were horizontal, and so the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. The sailors pushed at the stone in several places without result, and then one of them, Donovan he was called, felt over it all round the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the stone moulding, and his shipmates wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. And then very softly and very slowly, the vast panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Now Donovan slid down, or was it along, the jamb and rejoined his fellows, and everyone watched the queer recession of the monstrous portal. It moved anomalously in a diagonal way, so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed to be perfectly upset. The aperture was black with a darkness that was almost material. And in fact, the gloom, it was a positive quality because it had obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed, and it seemed to burst forth like smoke from its eon-long imprisonment. It visibly darkened the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky. The odour arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and then at length the men thought they heard a slopping sound. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still, when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the doorway into the outside air. Now, poor Johansen's handwriting, it almost gave out when he writes of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks that 2 of them perished from pure terror in that instant. I mean, the thing itself could not be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God, what wonder that across the earth an architect went mad. And poor Wilcox raved with fear in that telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars, had awoken to claim his own. The stars were right again. And what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose once more, and he was ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anybody could even turn. Another slipped as he ran, and Johansen swears that he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which simply should not have been there, an angle which was acute but behaved as if it was obtuse. Only Bryden and Johansen reached the boat and pulled desperately for the alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated at the water's edge. Now, steam had not been allowed to go down entirely, and it was the work of only a few moments to get the vessel underway. Slowly, she began to churn the waters, while that titanic thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like Polyphemus, cursing the trireme of Odysseus. And then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid into the water and began to pursue with wave-raising strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went insane, but Johansen, he had not yet given out. Knowing that the thing must surely overtake them, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, he ran on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian sailor drove his vessel head on against the pursuing fiend. The squid head with its writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit, but still Johansen drove on. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 open graves, and a sound that the chronicler could not or would not put on paper. For an instant, the ship was befouled by an acrid, blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern. Where, God in heaven, the plasticity of that monster was already recombining, while its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. And that was all. After that, Johansen only brooded over the idol in the cabin and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the drooling maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight. And then came the storm of April the 2nd and a gathering of clouds about his consciousness. There's a sense in his writing of whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through universes on a comet's tail, of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon and from the moon back again to the pit, all enlivened by a cachinnating chorus of the elder gods and the green bat-winged imps of Tartarus. And then out of that dream came rescue. The Vigilant, then the Vice Admiralty Court, the streets of Dunedin, the long voyage back home to the old house in Oslo. He could not tell anyone what he'd seen and done, he says. They'd think he was mad. He would write of what he knew before death came, but his wife must never guess. Death would be a boon if it could blot out the memories. So that was the document that I read. And I have now placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Angel. And with it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterwards be poison to me. But I do not think that my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, so I shall go. See, I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunk once more because the Vigilance sailed over this spot after the April storm. But his earthly ministers must still prance and slay around idol-clapped monoliths in lonely places. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. God, no. I must not think of that. Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity and see that it meets no other human eye. Well, Francis Wayland Thurston, the author of the document that I've read to you tonight, died suddenly last year. It's thought that his heart failed him, but no one could be sure. And I inherited his papers.